So I want to thank Neftali and everybody that's involved in organizing this conference. It's particularly good to be here since I have a little bit of history in the past with setting up the Nuestras Raíces project, which works out of Holyoke. And it was great to see the way that that project has grown and things that are being accomplished, and that it has helped to lead, in particular, to conferences like this. So I want to tell you just a little bit about our organization. We may not be quite the fit, or you may not think that we're quite the fit with the types of organizations that are represented here. And so you should know that the organization began essentially as a student movement. Students who were studying physics at MIT and Harvard in the late 60s were quite alarmed by the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and then subsequently during the Reagan administration were particularly alarmed by the thought that we would ring the planet with nuclear weapons. So they and some of their professors, including a couple of Nobel Prize winning physicists, decided to create what eventually became the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is about maintaining the prospect of humanity on planet Earth. And so we are worried about stemming the tide of global warming. We see that as one of the greatest threats, something that we've caused ourselves and that we need to respond to. We work in sustainably fueling, feeding, transporting ourselves, and in trying to prevent the risk of catastrophic nuclear war. So because we're all about the prospect of humanity on the planet, we're very conscious that at this particular time, humanity actually is confronting challenges that are going to require us to apply social skills. We're going to have to learn to work together as humanity to overcome some of the problems that we've created by not being aware of some of the consequences of what we think is progress and what we think is modernity. So one of those issues is the food system. So with the food system, we have one of those mirages where one way of understanding it is that it's been this unfettered process to reduce drudgery, to introduce technology, to increase productivity, to increase efficiency, and that unquestionably this is something that we all desire. And whether that actually works for all of us, of course, depends on who we are. And so the dominant perspective about this, one that tends to be the one that's transmitted, at least at agricultural colleges, is the perspective that I just described to you. And I want to start by quoting you Benjamin Franklin on some alternative ways of looking at what agriculture and the food system really are, so that then we can talk about transforming it from the system that currently exploits people and nature in spite of that rosy vision that I just described to you. What has been improved is the way in which we can exploit people and nature, not necessarily the objective of a food system that nourishes us and that actually regenerates nature and makes things better for everyone that's involved in the process. So the lesson from Benjamin Franklin goes like this. He wrote in a very interesting treatise that was actually on the nature of commerce the following. So there seem to be but three ways for a nation to acquire wealth. The first is by war, as the Romans did, in plundering their conquered neighbors. This is robbery. So anytime that an empire expands, by definition, an empire is taking over the lands of other people, it does so by war, and Franklin is saying this is robbery. The second means is by commerce, which is generally cheating. Now, this may seem strangely anti-capitalist, and so I need to explain very quickly that he wasn't making some Marxist statement before Marx. What he was writing in this much larger treatise was an examination of how you can tell whether a merchant is actually charging you a fair price. So in order for you to know that, you need to understand where raw materials came from and what the added value of the merchant was. And he was thinking specifically of raw products that at that time were brought over from Europe, and then some manufacture was made, and he was specifically working on textiles. So he thought that commerce as practice at that time was cheating when you actually didn't disclose or didn't have a way of understanding all of those additional costs, so that when a merchant quoted you a price, you didn't know whether that was really a fair price. And so this is why he makes this particular statement. Actually, it is strangely prescient and does really apply to modern times. And so the last thing, the third by agriculture, the only honest way wherein man receives a real increase of the seed thrown into the ground in a kind of continual miracle. So I'm going to be speaking to you partially as an agricultural scientist, and at the time that Benjamin Franklin wrote this, there actually was mostly truth behind that statement. Now, at the present time, namely after the discovery of fossil fuel and our application of fossil fuel to just about every human enterprise, this statement is no longer true. Modern agriculture doesn't function in this particular way. What we do now is spend more energy than we recover, and we've actually turned it into both war and cheating. This is modern industrial agriculture. We take over people's property, we take over people's resources. And so it is a very interesting perspective that comes to us way back from the 1700s that I'd like for us to apply to understanding the way that the system actually works. Now, I'm sure that all of you have sat through introductory anthropology classes where you've heard the story of how agriculture was invented. Usually, because we are agriculturists, we think this was a good thing, this was a virtuous thing. Almost everything that is around us is due to, as most anthropologists would tell you, due to the advancement that allowed saving of labor, therefore allowed specialization, and therefore allowed stratification of societies. Now, that's another way of telling you that with agriculture, we entered into a phase that actually required some people to do drudgery, some people to benefit, and that stratification was called having social classes, including people that did the drudgery, oftentimes against their will. Because you have to remember that what existed prior to that was essentially what holy books, I'm not religious, but what holy books call paradise. So you basically went out and gathered. Carrying capacity of humanity was restricted by the carrying capacity for what each ecosystem could provide. Agriculturists are the people that refuse to recognize that limit. But they don't do so because they're magicians, they do so because they concentrate resources from a wide area into a staging area, and that's how they overcome the carrying capacity of a particular place. So I'll come back to that again, and let's actually illustrate what this looks like. So we began to practice agriculture in places like this. This is a river delta. What a river does is essentially wash and concentrate the resources from a very vast watershed and basically release them at the mouth or the delta of the river. This is where you naturally, through geological mechanisms and hydrological mechanisms, enrich the fertility of that particular area. So these were prime places to overcome the natural carrying capacity of the ecosystem outside of that river delta. So all it would take is observance of that phenomenon, and you can bet that people that depended on what nature gave were very observant about where things were more productive and the seasonality of that. So the majority of agriculture around the planet actually continues to be of this style. It's called runoff agriculture. You basically find places where nature is concentrating resources naturally. So another place where this happens is at Piedmonts. So this is an alluvial fan in the Coachella Valley down in the southern part of California. You can see that still the agriculture is concentrated down at the bottom. You see an aqueduct down at the bottom. And that alluvial fan is formed from the washing of that higher area by thousands of years of mechanical degradation of that area by periodic rainfall. Now, one way of thinking about the amount of work that's required to do it is that imagine that you wanted to do that intentionally. So, you need backhoes, you need caterpillars, you need all kinds of carrying equipment with modern technology in order to do this, and it is still a tremendous piece of work, actually probably unfeasible to try to do this, to try to replicate it. So a system like this is something that is sustainable. A very simple question, it just means how long can you keep on doing this in this particular way? Well, a system like this is sustainable as long as this process is happening, as long as that geological process is happening. It's happening whether human beings are around or not. So if human beings are around and they insert themselves into that process can be sustainable over geological eras. So again, I repeat, with modern agriculture, we refuse to hold ourselves to that limitation. We consider ourselves to be particularly clever because we create these virtual alluvial fans where basically we'll concentrate the resources that we need, particularly the few, what agriculturists refer to as limiting resources. And this is what they look like. Now, I want all of that context to support the following declaration. Without that, it might have seemed just an extreme statement to launch out with. In order for this system to work, in order for places like the Central Valley of California, in order for the Midwest, in order for the Cerrado of Brazil, in order for the Pampas of Argentina, the entire corn belt in southern Africa, the entire wheat and corn belt of Central Africa, the northeastern corn belt of China, in order for the 7 major agricultural basins of the planet to appear to be miraculously fertile, the nutrients need to come from someplace. the water needs to come from someplace. Somebody had that land before industrialists, business people, took over that land. And so the game of agriculture is not the tractors, it's not the seeds, it's how do you establish control over the source of water, nutrients, fossil fuel, and land. That's the game of agriculture, the modern version of agriculture. So let me tell you a little story here. This story is useful because of the fact that often we can understand the situation that we're experiencing if we see other people experiencing that situation before it dawns on us that we're actually experiencing something similar. So what I want to do is transport you to a completely different world, one with which we're connected much more closely than most of us realize. And so we're going to go over to the west coast of Africa, and I particularly want to talk to you about the Niger River Delta. So for those of you not familiar, this is the course of the Niger River, and the delta is right here. And so the mouth opens up into the ocean at this spot. And this has been a place where for thousands of years people have found livelihood pretty much along the lines of what I just described to you. People hunted, gathered, and in the delta they practiced agriculture. I'll describe to you in just a little bit that this was mostly producing plantains and tubers. And so this is an area which now is quite blighted, it is quite exploited. It is in the news quite a bit because of the fact that it continues to be both rich in its natural mineral resources, but also rich in oil, which of course attracts the attention of us because we need all of those resources. And so this is the story that I want to tell you. In order to manufacture what we think is our right, stuff like this, there's all kinds of ingredients that need to be supplied from all over the planet. And so one of these ingredients is, and you know, we could tell a story like the one I'm about to tell you for each one of these ingredients, but I'm just going to tell you about one of these ingredients, which is palm kernel oil. And so here's the story that I want you to be aware of. So the people that settled at the mouth of this river when Europeans found them, so these were Belgians and English, when they began to explore and then conquer and colonize that part of the world. These people were the brass. Now, the brass at that time, late 1700s to early 1800s, were ruled by a confederation of chiefs. One of them wrote to Whitehall, basically the British Foreign Office. His name was King Okiya. Now, I'm just going to paraphrase what this letter said that he wrote to Whitehall. It goes something like this. Some time ago, you folks showed up. You didn't really interfere with us. But presently, you started going up the river and you started to tell us what we could do on our land. And you made a deal with us where you said that if we could actually concentrate, and this is a paraphrase, if we could concentrate palm oil nuts from upriver, that we could trade with you. So we entered into this. It was a very good deal. But now, you no longer allow us to do this because now you've come in with steamships. Now you go up the river yourselves, and now you're appropriating that supply. So before that, they had been middle people. So they no longer were middle people. Now the British completely took over the entire supply chain and modern terminology. And so it displaced them. Now an economist will tell you, you can either create wealth, or the flip side of that, you can invent poverty and hunger by controlling three factors of production. So land, the obvious one, first factor of production, labor, by which you turn that land into production or productivity, and of course, rent. That allows us to express our entrepreneurship. If you don't have access to at least one of those factors of production, then you will be poor and you'll be hungry. If you deprive other people of those factors of production, then you are making them poor and you are making them hungry, which is what the British did. So King Okiya and his confederation of chiefs understood exactly what was happening, and they wrote to appeal to the British Foreign Office saying, look what you're doing. And they did so in language that would be very similar to language that you would use in today's global trade negotiations. It was very rational language, basically stating who was there, who had the original rights to the land and the resources, what agreements had been made, that the agreements had been broken, and therefore that this needed to be rectified. Whitehall never wrote back, and one of the prophetic lines in King Okiya's letter was, If we don't have access to that land, and if we can't plant plantains and tubers, then my people will starve and we shall disappear. Which is why you've never heard of the brass. That's exactly what happened. Now, that story is a story that has been repeated thousands of times around the planet so that we can have our Ritz. Now, today, palm oil still comes from West Africa, although now you know that the majority of the supply is coming from doing exactly what I just described to you, displacing people, denuding forests in Southeastern Asia. It's their turn now to experience that phenomenon, so we can enjoy our Ritz crackers. Now, if you don't know about that, then you could really enjoy your Ritz crackers. So the point is, we have to know about these sorts of things and either not enjoy the Ritz crackers or change the way that that whole system works. Because, remember what I told you, that's a nice story when you tell it about other people. Now, let's tell it about ourselves and how we are involved. And so for that, let's take a look at the demographics of the United States. Very gross picture here. But I want to show you, first of all, is how we're distributed by ethnicity. So notice that the majority of the population are descendants of European colonists, and then we have these proportions of African Americans, First Peoples, and Hispanics. So come back and make other comments about that. But what I really want us to concentrate on is that when you talk about poverty, and therefore what in a cash economy is hunger in the United States, so poverty is the best proxy for hunger in the United States, notice how disproportionate the rate of that is by ethnicity. And by the argument that I just laid out to you, we need to understand that these are not unfortunate people. That there have been very deliberate actions taken that we continue to reinforce at this moment that creates that poverty and hunger in the United States in the 21st century, and nowhere is that more manifest than in the food system itself. And so, we'll come back to this. We'll see this again, but I want to talk to you about these dynamics really quickly. By the way, it leads through the program very swiftly. My guess is you've heard about all of this already, and put your seatbelts on, because Leah's going to talk to you about this in more detail after I get done. You really didn't need to have me here. Leah will tell you the whole story. So let me tell you about the fact that what I've just described to you has been a result of explicit, concerted U.S. policy. So this is not a story about some people that are misbehaving. This has been the official policy of the nation. First of all, factor of production 1, land. The colonists that landed on the eastern coast began to acquire land, displacing people, eliminating people, warring against people, until it eventually became a matter of official policy. So there was a concerted campaign that we all should be aware of that lasted 50 years. It was quick work when you think about it. 50 years, half a century, to displace the majority of the Native American population of North America and to eliminate them. So this campaign of genocide was a specific government policy initiated in 1830 by the Native American Removal Act. So that Congress in 1830 had no compunction about telling you exactly what they meant. So today's Congress might be a little bit more artful in naming a piece of legislation like that. Back then there was no need. The American Indian Removal Act of 1830 essentially did the majority of this work. The work was consummated in the 1880s with the Apache Wars down in the Southwest, and specifically, more symbolically, with the Wounded Knee Massacre, what the Department of the Army at the time liked to call the Wounded Knee Battle. It was a massacre of elders, of women, and children who were doing nothing but performing a ghost dance. And so we actually have photographs that the Department of the Army took. Here's Chief Bigfoot, which I showed you just as the last campaign that essentially marked the end of a concerted U.S. policy to remove all of these people from land that subsequently became the breadbasket of the United States. So another piece of that concerted campaign was actually to appropriate land that belonged to another country, as you know. So there's no way that you can go to the western part of the United States or the southern, southwestern part of the United States without having to speak a lot of Spanish. You're going to have to be going to places like Oregon, Montaña, Nevada, California, Arizona, all these places, and the capital cities that are called Sacramento, Santa Fe, down the line. And so all of that because these places had been settled for hundreds of years before the colonists from what would become the United States actually got to that part of the country. So let's move on to the second factor, production, labor. The country of the United States as we know it would not have been possible, would not have the characteristic of the shape that we have right now, had its wealth not been built up by abducting people from another part of the planet, brutally separating them from their families, their folkways, their languages, intentionally so. 12 million of them over about 350 years for the entire continent. About 3.5 million of them ended up in what is the continental United States. Brutalizing them, exploiting them, building up the wealth of large-scale agriculture in the Southwest, basically the prototype for what industrial agriculture is today. Now, it would be one thing if we could say that that is in the past. But you know that even after emancipation, exactly the same designs continue to occur completely to this day. If you know how to read headlines, you know that this is still occurring. And so, you know, some of these things you might look at in textbooks and say, well, this was what was going on during the Jim Crow era, and this is all safely in our past. But I repeat, if you know how to read headlines, what the culture of this country is saying is there was a utility to your ancestors. You, the descendants of these people, remember your place. What that wealth created was not intended for you. Now, if this sounds particularly brutal to you, I want to tie all of this together by saying, those of us in this room really do have a choice. What our ancestors did is undoable. They did that. Those of us in this room have a choice about the future that we're going to create. And we can't make the best choices unless we understand what preceded and gave us what many of us may understand as just the nature of things. We need to understand the intentional actions that were performed in order to give us the world that we think functions well for us according to how we are, who we are, by class and by ethnicity. Now, as you know, by the way, the brother there is Rashad Davis, who was essentially coming back from work on this particular day, and basically was told that because he was carrying a backpack, he was suspicious. So let's go on to what has happened with this story. You might say, okay, according to textbooks, that slavery has been banished. And of course, slavery now is very sophisticated. It has evolved. There are completely different mechanisms to exploit labor today. So the labor that we exploit today tends to be immigrant labor. It tends to have been labor that we actually shook loose from where it was originally, central, southern Mexico, northern, central America. In the most recent episode, due to trade policies that flooded that part of the world, which was very dependent on self-provisioning corn agriculture, with cheap industrial corn from the United States. And those folks could no longer compete in the market with big government-supported corn producers in the United States. Their choice was either be poor or respond to the demand for labor that is coming from the United States that is not met by American workers. Why is that? Because of the fact that people that are in desperate economic situations will do anything that they can for their families to survive. So they are responding to the demand for labor of the sort that I described at the top of the conversation. Brutish labor, the labor that we're not going to do for ourselves. I taught at Iowa State University for 18 years. In a course on world food issues, at the end of the course, I would give out a survey to my students. Heart of gold people from the Midwest, 18 to 22 years of age. One of the questions that I asked there was, what wage would it take for you to do meat packing? So, one way that you can look at the system that I just described is that the massive corn production system of the Midwest is a very systematic way of displacing self-provisioning farmers from Central America and concentrate them again around meatpacking plants and vegetable producing and dairy producing in various parts of the United States. So I would ask this question very intentionally to know, is this work that you would do for a particular wage? Is really the low wage the issue here? And the answer, on average, tended to be, this was not work that I'm going to do at any wage. And I particularly remember one individual, these were anonymous, so people could write whatever they want. One individual, this is just seared into my brain. I don't blame the individual, but this is what the individual expressed, just as part of the culture that he or she was brought up in. This is Mexican work. So, with that, just imagine the whole worldview that opens up for you. There are just things that we won't deign to do that are for lesser human beings to perform. So this is the way that this system has evolved. The cudgel that we use, of course, is the immigration policies of the nation, which are completely made up. We choose what they're going to be. The reason that they're a cudgel is that, look at the way that the factors of production move around the planet. So, look at the way that we have decided that capital is liquid. Capital can move and be invested in whatever part of the planet we want, or it can be harvested and returned to any other part of the planet that we want. In mercantile times, that was not the way that things operated. We made up these rules. Likewise, trade exists because we've decided that we want to eliminate as many barriers to trade, at least up until this administration, and ship materials all over the planet. There is a very well-known principle of economics that we're all better off according to that, David Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage. And so we do that for materials, we do that for capital, we don't do that for labor. Labor can't move around the planet in response to supply and demand. We throw up the barrier of immigration status. Even though we cannot meet the demand for labor here, and there is plentiful and willing labor willing to come, the way that we use this as a cudgel is we can exploit people. So if you're not aware of this, just to run down the litany very quickly. When I say exploitation, you know, I'm not pulling out my hanky and tearing out for no good reason. Let me tell you what some of this involves. There is an exemption to U.S. labor law that says that children of migrant workers are not required to be in school and they can be out in the field with their parents. It's an exemption that tells you exactly who this is intended to apply to. Everybody else is expected to have their children in school. Now, how about this? There are occupational safety and health provisions that we all expect to apply to us in whatever place we work. However, again, through a couple of different exemptions to law, agricultural workers can be exposed to some of the more toxic chemicals that are known to human beings, and they are not protected, and therefore they suffer disproportionately from all sorts of cancers and respiratory diseases that are a consequence of that exposure. They have no particular guarantee to things such as water breaks or restroom breaks. These are left up to either individual states or sometimes down to the individual farm. The place where the exploitation really occurs is in the buffer that's created between farmers that contract with labor contractors and the actual workers themselves. If wage theft occurs, what are these people going to do? Are they going to sue? They're illegal. They're terrified of the political force of the nation. Yet, without these people, here's something to remark. Without these people, the agricultural system of the United States does not work. Full stop, no qualification. And if the agricultural system doesn't work, we don't eat. So if we're eating, and all of this is happening, we're exploiting them. We're condoning this. It's the way that the system works. It's not an accidental feature of the system, it's an explicit feature of the system. Slavery has not disappeared. Slavery has evolved. It is very sophisticated these days. And so one way of understanding this, I thought it was particularly sad when some of the deepest understanding of these issues actually comes from a comedian. Not very funny, you know, very straight truth. So here's Chris Rock telling you, I used to work at a McDonald's making minimum wage. You know what that means when someone pays you minimum wage, don't you? It means that your boss is trying to say, hey, if I could pay you less, I would, but it's against the law. So for the people that can't appeal to the protection of the law, this does happen. And so that's what I mean when I say exploitation, not hollow words. Okay, so I promise you that we'd come back to this. So, very specific, deliberate actions supported by policy decisions actually explain why we have this situation. In spite of the popular culture mores or the explanations for this about how some people just can't help themselves or how some people aren't ambitious and some people don't work hard, believe me, if you're familiar with what the enslaved population did to survive for 350 years, if you're familiar with what today's immigrant laborers do so we can have the food that we eat, the fruits, the vegetables, the packed meat, the milk, the dairy products, you know that the contrary is true. They're the hardest working people in the entire continental United States, the most exploited people in the continental United States. So what you're seeing here are not unfortunate people. What you're seeing here is the roadkill on the way to creating the modern industrial system. So this is what we need to repair. So we have our work cut out for us because of the fact that, as I've said, the system is a system that was designed this way. And I will say to you, I see that we have brothers and sisters from all across the ethnic spectrum here, and I just want to say something to you very quickly. So, Mama is German-American. I don't want you to feel singled out, you know, if you're a descendant of a European sitting in this room, because I want to tell you this. these colonists designed a world for themselves. And what we are trained to understand about who was to benefit from this when we go to school is what they told themselves. Didn't apply to everybody by design. So let me tell you a story. Manuela and I are from Mexico, as Neftali told you, state of Oaxaca. I was teaching at Iowa State. Our children went to an elementary school in Iowa. And I very distinctly remember the day when our little kid, named Tlacaelel, after one of the Aztec emperors, comes running in the room. And he says, Mama, guess what I learned today? I wasn't at home. I'm going to tell you this later. But our ancestors came from Germany. So, as it happened, his grandma is, descended from Germans. But I thought that was a very interesting insight into, the received wisdom and how the orthodoxy actually can take over the reality. So let me talk to you about this just a little bit. So in this document, this is the famous one that you all know at least a few key passages from, and this is the one that says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal. Notice the fast one I'm pulling there. It actually says all men are created equal, but we interpret it today as to mean as if all human beings are created equal. Well, in that same way, the other fast one is that what they meant by all men was all white men, very specifically. So let me run through this very quickly so that we can tell how the history of the United States is actually making a claim against that statement. That simple statement that all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator, yada yada, the whole passage. Okay, so I will do this very quickly, and remember that as we go through this, the point is not the individual examples, because those could be history lessons in and of themselves that we could go on for weeks and weeks understanding, but it is to draw the picture who the nation was intended to benefit from and what we're trying to undo. That it isn't an accident that we feel like those of us that believe in equity and justice are actually fighting a system. We quite deliberately are fighting a system. And so here it is. So for instance, it wasn't until a very long and fraught period between 1792 and 1856 that eventually all states abolished the qualification of owning property before you could be eligible to vote. You were not a full citizen unless you were eligible to vote. So the gentry, the wealthy gentry created the nation and the laws that served them from the very beginning. It took that long in order to undo that. The last state to do so was North Carolina. Here's another example. I told you already about the experience of appropriating about half of what had been Mexico in 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo essentially disenfranchised, against what the treaty itself actually said, all of the folks that had lived in what was formerly Mexico one day and then became the United States the next day. By treaty, they were supposed to have all the rights of U.S. citizens, but immediately they were denied those rights because they could not speak English. One day to the next. This was the knife's edge that was used in order to begin to marginalize that particular population. Again, believe me, each one of these we could spend weeks on. In 1870, the 15th Amendment actually made it so that non-white men and freed slaves actually gained the franchise. Now you should know this was nominally, because up until this day, from that period up until this day, this has been countered by explicit efforts to suppress the vote of these individuals. So just take stock of what's happening up until now. So now, people that can vote are people that, first of all, men, all men, and now African American, and now people that don't own land. And note the date, 1870. So let's keep on progressing through this. And so if we use the proxy of being eligible for the franchise, in 1887, the Dawes Act made it possible so that, at least in theory, members of First Peoples could actually vote. But this was conditional. They needed to be willing to disassociate from their tribe. You can see the logic. Basically the steamroller approach to disappearing Native people. If you couldn't do it by genocide, then you could do it by cultural genocide. So it wasn't until 1920, after about 100 years of effort, that women actually acquired the right to vote. Now, for a period of time, there were similar voter suppression efforts. I want you to note that this occurred in 1920. Now we're getting into very recent historical times. And I want you to dwell on the fact that it is a very recent feature of American history that women have been recognized as full citizens, 1920. So we're approximating just 100 years, just a century of that having occurred. Coming back again to Native Americans, in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act attempted to rectify that bias of the Dawes Act by giving all Native Americans the right to vote. However, it wasn't really until after the Second World War that anywhere near fulfillment of this right actually was acquired. So let's take a look at what it actually took. It was essentially the embarrassment of Native Americans having been key, particularly in the South Pacific Wars, coming home and then not being able to vote in New Mexico and Arizona, and suing the US government because they theoretically had the right, but were being suppressed on their own territory, that it eventually helped to redress this. And we're talking 1947 when this occurred. Some of us in the room were alive already when this occurred. In 1952, very similar phenomenon for people of all Asian ancestry, which, by the way, we had been treating separately. You know, if you came from Japan, it wasn't the same as if you came from India. It wasn't the same as if you came from China. Remember that China had been the original source of a lot of the exploited labor with which California agriculture, first of all, was driven, and then railroads were constructed. So they experienced exactly the same sort of labor exploitation that I've been describing for other populations. It wasn't until 1965 that the injustice of the Jim Crow era was addressed by the Civil Rights Act, and of course you know that this story is far from over because of the fact that just very recently in 2013, in a case known as Shelby County versus Holder, Chief Justice John Roberts actually wrote the following: that the protections of the Civil Rights Act were no longer necessary because they were not needed anymore. And of course, what happened immediately after this was rolled back was that, of course, voter suppression took up with vengeance and had major effects in the most recent election that we all just experienced. So I'm talking to you here not about historical features, I'm talking to you about the present United States, where by concerted action and attempted legal and judicial techniques, we are still wanting to suppress a portion of the population of the United States. And remember, the particular portion of the population that I'm describing here enabled the wealth and the industrial development of the United States upon which this country was built. Without them, this country is not the country that we have right now. I'll pull just one little thread of that. Some of these former slaves had been promised, if they were in Virginia, North Carolina, Southern Maryland, that they would be given land and mules and 40 acres in order to continue as free men. These were former slaves that chose to side with the North and fight against their former masters. They were taking a huge risk. That promise was broken, as many of you probably know. I just want to remind you of the following feature. During that 350-year period when the wealth of the United States was built up through the mercantile economy of first producing tobacco, which then became sugar, which then became cotton, all of these major plantation crops, and where the drudgery was performed by enslaved people, you can bet that the slave masters in the South were not producing their own food. It was the enslaved folks that were also producing their own food. So that at the time of emancipation, or the Emancipation Act, theoretical emancipation, if you want to speak of demographic groups in the United States, nobody understood agriculture and food production better than the nation's African American population. Nobody. And remember that by not giving them the ability to express their creativity, their entrepreneurial genius, it wasn't just them who were affected, it was this entire country that was affected by suppressing positive, creative energy, and to this day. So what we're talking about here are not just interesting historical features, it's actually remarking on the fact that we continue to abide under a mentality in the 21st century that there is a reference population of Americans in the United States, and the rest of us are minorities to be tolerated, which means to put up with. In other words, there's what's supposed to be an American, and then there's everyone else who was brought here to serve those people. We have not gotten over this. It may seem like a crude thing, and so let me just point out, it is not divisive to point these things out. It is telling the truth. What is divisive is to appropriate land, to enslave people, to massacre people. That's divisive. Telling the truth so that then we can reform this system, that's actually healing. It should lead to healing. because new knowledge about what the actual situation is will drive us to do that. So, not long ago, the Los Angeles Times published a series that lasted a week long. Many of you probably followed this, and it was a commentary on the results of the recent election and the individual who now holds the office of president. And one of the commentaries was this: the United States is not a perfect country, and it has a great distance to go before it fully achieves its goals of liberty and equality. But preserving what works and defending the rules and values on which democracy depends are a shared responsibility. Everybody has a role to play in this drama. So this is an interesting understanding for all of us to come to. So I'll repeat this in slightly different words. This country has achieved great things in the history of humanity. We need to remember that they have come at great cost and with great injustice. But there is great potential if we remember this, that it took all of our labor, it took some of our land, it took some of our creativity, and if we would unleash the creativity of everyone, imagine what this country could be. So let's shift from that, and actually let me just, I've been haranguing you here, 3:11. Neftali, I have until 3:30? Okay, so let's shift here. And so let's talk about a different vision of what the food system could be. So I am going to quote to you from a very wise woman in just a little bit. But I'm going to tease you a little bit by telling you that the wisdom that I admire from her was basically the insight that for things to change, we need to have completely different objectives in mind to begin with. This is not about just refining or tweaking the way that the current system works. The current system explicitly is about exploiting people and nature, as I've made the case. So we need to have a system that has completely different vision for how the system ought to perform, what the outcome should be. And I'm very conscious of the fact that when we talk that way, we may get into the territory of romanticism, and I want to make the case that that in itself is not bad, but that it isn't entirely romanticism. So when I came to Union of Concerned Scientists, which was just 5 years ago, we started working on the notion that actually our colleagues at Harvard have wonderfully expanded this notion of having what they're calling now a national food plan. So it's this notion that if we want something better, we just need to declare what it is, and then we need to have coherent policy that actually gets us there. The policies that we have right now, which are disparate, as I'm sure you heard, and in many cases are counterproductive and work against each other, actually serve the purpose of making the system complicated and making some of us say some of the things that I heard as I came into the room, who can understand that, what's going on. Well, all of that confusion serves a particular purpose. So a nation which operates on the resources of all of us needs to do better. We need to have a very explicit notion of what our public resources need to be supporting. So it's become very clear now, rather than just being a theoretical enterprise, that in order to overturn the nature of the system that we have right now, all of us here, people that would come to a conference like this, need to build our political power. Now that's the part that probably is the most romantic of all, but I want to address what we're doing about this, and specifically how we can turn the energy of activities such as these, which I'm sure every one of you has been participating in. I've just come from 2 subsequent weeks of the Climate March and the Science March in advance of that, and women got it all started immediately the weekend after the election and so on. So we're activated, but of course, as you all know, we need to channel all of this in a particular direction that is politically effective. And so we need to be keenly aware of what we need to overcome. And I know that this is not news to all of you, but for my story to be coherent, let me just state, at meetings like this, it is very common to be political, or to be diplomatic, and to be very careful, to aim for comedy. And you can't whitewash things that need to be repaired. You can't apply a soft brushstroke to things that are evil. You need to actually say, this cannot be, and we need to change it. So I'm quoting you here the following: I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial by strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country. If you couldn't tell just by what probably sounds like quaint English to you, this wasn't written any time recently. It was written by Thomas Jefferson before he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So that the concentration of wealth and the attempt to actually abrogate political freedoms in service of what today we would call the corporate sector. It wasn't that at the time, but it was the merchant and the bourgeois class. That already manifests at the very beginning of the history of this country, and the history of this country is that power has been ascendant, as exemplified by the current government, which is a plutocratic government, run by millionaires for the interests of the millionaires. Now, so this is actually the enemy. Now, this may sound really stark, but let me tell you that good people, we all know from examples of history, and you probably have personal examples of this in your own family, I certainly do. Good people, for all the right reasons, can still do the wrong thing. So there are folks in here that probably believe that they're helping to feed the world, or that they want to deal with hunger, and so on. And yet, because of the mechanism that they have to turn on quarterly profit sheets that show that they grow year after year after year, and where the beneficiaries are not actually part of the business cycle, they're actually over on the side, holding stock in the company, whipping the company to perform in that particular way, regardless of what they actually do. Food is actually incidental to the whole thing. It's the profit that matters in this particular model. So, because of the fact that we need to be really clear what we're fighting, let's just take a look at how things would be bad enough if we were just extracting wealth and concentrating. But look at what the system does to all of us, aided and abetted by public policy and our resources, our tax dollars. So it first of all makes us sick. These are all statistics that you're familiar with. They're not a point of this particular conversation, but I'll just document what they are. Some of you may be familiar with Mark Bittman, he's a good friend, and one of the reasons why I really value his skill, he'll do something like listen to me prattle on just like this for about 40 minutes, and when I get done, he just kind of cocks his head and he says, "Oh, what you mean is," and then he'll say one sentence. And so, after one such conversation, he wrote this column in the Times, and here's the key line. It's hard to imagine having a food supply as abundant as ours and doing a worse job with it. The system makes us sick. Even people who think that they're beneficiaries of it because they can eat whatever they want, whenever they want it, whether it's in season or not, whether it's native to their place, whether they know how to prepare it or not, it makes you sick. And so, clearly there's all kinds of reasons why this needs to be improved. Now, let's go back to this image that we were taking a look at before. Our so-called representatives in government. Let me show you a couple of figures here. This is the figure of how you actually get things done with this Congress. You lobby it. And this is particularly the illustration of what happens with food and agricultural lobbying. That's the agribusiness sector. You can tell that on average, they're investing about $100 million a year. Now, this is a $1.8 trillion business in the United States. So $100 million a year to them collectively, not any one company, collectively, these are pennies behind the sofa. They do not even feel it. The return on investment is 1,000-fold for many of these companies. It has been measured. So it goes up in Farm Bill years. We can expect that in this year it's going to be going up. And here's one of the outcomes of that. This is a study that, if you're interested in, its authors are Gillens and Page, and it's in Perspective in Politics. It was published in 2014. What they did very briefly was to take 18 years of legislation in Congress, so at the federal level, and then ask who benefits from this legislation. And they broke down the population into quintiles. And so what this graph illustrates is they found a very strong tendency that the more wealthy you are, the more likely that Congress is going to vote in favor of your interests. This is, and they conclude in their research, after looking at thousands of pieces of legislation, you don't have a Congress that represents the interests of the public, you have a Congress that represents the interests of the wealthy, which is why I said earlier, come back to this point, that is the textbook definition of a plutocracy. So this is what we've got and what we need to overcome. If it isn't clear from a graph like that, I want to show you a few figures here. Here are the number of farms that have American Indian or Alaska Native operators. By and large, First Peoples who farm and ranch are producing cattle. This is just a statistical average. Here's the number of farms with Asian operators, and again, by and large, they're fruit and vegetable producers on the West Coast, statistically speaking. Here's where the number of farms with Black or African American operators are concentrated, again, for historical reasons. And remember, this number should be tens of times greater than that had it not been for suppression and land loss. But here's where they are. Again, statistically, African American farmers tend to produce cattle. And the number of farms with Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino origin operators, as you'd expect, concentrated here. And so I'm showing you all of this quickly to then ask you this question. Here's the percentage of farms with female principal operators, primarily food and vegetable producers and dairy operators. So here's the question. So let's take a look at federal agricultural subsidies. Where do you think they go?
Corn and soy.
Okay, everything in blue there is where federal dollars per person are more than 700. So you see, I was not kidding you when I told you that that wave of colonists from the Northeast that needed land displaced the Native American population. And let me quote to you one of my students in Iowa, looked at me in my eyes, and again, not this person's fault, really believed what she was telling me. She looks at me and she says, we are so blessed to have this fertile land. And as we had just seen, there were very deliberate actions that explain why that population has that land and why they write rules that benefit themselves. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, and now that we've covered this, let me tell you the explanation of this that Frederick Bastiat articulated very succinctly. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. That's where we are. So this is what I meant when I said we need to understand what we're trying to overturn. We need to have a real clear-eyed understanding of that in order to come up with a way to deal with it. So here's our way. So we at the Union of Concerned Scientists are working with an alliance whose specific purpose is to build the political power that will be necessary in order to create a completely different vision of an agricultural and food system. HEAL stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor, very explicitly cross-sectoral. Everybody needs to be involved. So farm laborers, farmers, the people that process, the people that manufacture, the people that sell, and the people that buy, everybody needs to be involved. It isn't one part of society that knows better what's best for everybody else. That model, as you can see, is bound cooking us, explaining nature, explaining people, making us sick, everything that you're familiar with. I want you to know how this came up. So this idea is an idea of young people. I'm basically just hanging on to their coattails for dear life. And let me just show you how some of these people are. They already mentioned, I'll go from the right to the left here. There's Dara Cooper from the Black Food Justice Coalition. And then you see Jose Oliva with the Food Chain Workers Alliance, and you see Adim Steele, who was with the Food Project, is now with the Real Food Generation. I'm sitting there mostly just thrilled because they were in my office. And Amelia Moore, one of my colleagues, is sitting next to Nina Khanna, based in Oakland with the Movement Strategy Center, who is HEAL's director. And out of the heads of these young people is where the ideas that I'm about to describe to you came. They basically looked at the history of successful movements, and they said, we don't need another organization. There's plenty of organizations, and everybody here that's got an organization, whether it's hunger, whether it's sustainability, whether you're working to reduce food waste, all of the things that make up all of the subparts of the food movement, you need to continue doing what you're doing. But what we do need is a venue where we coordinate what we're doing, where we can add up the power that we all have. Because each of us by ourselves, I have a little team of 14 people. I'm not going to do anything against the power that I just described to you. So we need each other to begin with. So what we need is a place, a venue where we can say there's a threat over there, there's a shark over there, there's an opportunity over here, there's food over here, let's go over there. The idea for HEAL is that that's where we're going to do that stuff. We're going to coordinate what everybody is talking. And so what Nalina calls this is aligned leadership. And so we need to be working together. We need to have a venue where we actually explore how we're going to react to either the opportunities and threats in the environment. HEAL has had one convening to date just a couple of months ago. This is what it looks like. It looks very different from what a lot of food meetings look like that I go to. It represents lots of organizations that you may be familiar with. I'll just mention a few of these so that you can get an idea what the spectrum is. The Animal Agriculture Reform Collaboration, the Black Urban Growers, the Center for Rural Affairs. How about Corporate Accountability International, Comité de Apoyo a los Trabajadores Agrícolas, Policy Link, the Predatory Hunger Project, let's see, Real Food Generation, Rock United. Rock, as you know, is run by Saru Jayaranam. Saru has one of probably the simplest explanations of what's wrong with our food system. Start at the front of the restaurant, the more you go to the back of the house, the browner it gets. So this is what she's working to counter. Rooted in community, rural coalition, school food focus. Anyway, over 50 organizations are currently part of this, and it is open to any organization to join that shares in those particular values. Now, HEAL has constituted itself into 3 working groups. I want to tell you just real quickly what these are and why we've chosen them. There's the community and translocal leadership. One of the things that you need to do if you want to reform is you can wave your arms and that'll be ineffective. You can talk about these sorts of things and you'll still be ineffective. You'll be viewed as, sour grapes. What is actually going to bring about change is if you have a better idea and you can implement it and you can make it work and you can point to it and you can say, this is better than what we've got right now. This produces more, is more profitable for everybody, doesn't exploit people, doesn't exploit nature, let's do this. If you can do that, then that is what's going to work. So that's what we're attempting to do with this. We have some models that we're working with. One of these is operating mostly on the West Coast, but also we're slowly seeding it throughout the country. It's called the Good Food Purchasing Plan. If you're not familiar with it, it is a way to leverage procurement dollars that municipalities and institutions already have to purchase food. They don't need new money. They just decide how they want to spend that money to support a different food system. So the second working group that we have is political leadership. This system that I described to you is not going to change itself. And so you need to have politicians and people that run campaigns and people that raise money that think in a completely different way about what government can be. And we need to find those people, nurture them, train them, give them funding. And so beginning this fall, he was establishing what we're calling the Political Leadership Institute, where we're going to take a cohort of people and begin to do that work. Because unless those people are out there, the system is not going to shift by itself. And the last thing, this working group is working on clean corporations. A very neutral name is selected for the following reason. I've said to you, it's the corporate sector that is the enemy. And I'll stand behind that statement. Because the food system is the private sector. That's where the food system is. That's the global logistical system that takes all the different parts of the planet, reconfigures them, plays the shell game, then delivers to you everything that you want as long as you have the economic power to make it perform for you. So if it works for you, that system ends up actually making you sick and concentrating wealth in places like Switzerland, in places like Chicago, in places like New York, and so on. So that neutral name comes from realizing that there are entrepreneurs out there that can do exactly what I just said, demonstrate that there's a way that you can do this without exploiting people and exploiting nature. And if they can do this, we want to lift them up, while at the same time not being naive about this and doing everything that we can to pressure and counter the way that the majority of the private sector operates. Now, the theory of change goes something like this. This comes from a group of young people, again, that's called the Movement Generation. You can look them up and go read more about this theory of change. And it goes something like this. So, if what you want to do is to change the way that the system operates, there are 3 different phases that you need to work on. And so HEAL is operating this way. One, you need to counter the false solutions. I just talked about pressuring the corporate sector that's doing all the wrong things. So a false solution, here's an example. Population is growing, therefore we need to produce ever more food. Therefore we need to intensify what we're producing. We need more machines, we need more chemicals, we need more fertilizers, we need biotech, because there's a lot of hunger in the world. Meanwhile, don't notice that the more we do that, the less we actually deal with hunger. It doesn't address that. It's completely independent of that. Don't pay attention to that. Population is growing, let's continue to produce more food. That's obviously a false solution. So we need to make it so whoever makes that argument is embarrassed to be making that argument in public because it shows how little they understand the way that the food system works, or it shows that they're cynical. Either of those 2 things they need to be embarrassed for doing. So that's countering false solutions. And then what we need to do is to actually come up with what we really need. And so we've described some of the efforts that we're making to come up with better business models and community-based alternatives. One of the key premises of the HEAL Food Alliance is that we need to start working with what in Spanish we're calling grupos de base, or in English is the grassroots groups or the frontline groups. These are the groups that are actually experiencing the brunt of all of the negative effects of the food system. If you're wealthy, you may not be as conscious of some of the things that I've just spoken about. Believe me, the grassroots groups know. And therefore, they have the better ideas about what could better replace what we have right now. So you have to start with them. So that's a basic foundational premise. So you have to build up those models so you can point to them. So then you expose what doesn't work, and specifically you have to make it so if you really are successful in embarrassing people that are making those arguments and you're saying, look, you're just making yourself rich, you're making everybody else sick, This is not operating by market rules. Here's one real quick illustration of that. If this operated by market rules, it would go like this. The theory of the market is if you have free buyers and free sellers, and they have transparent access to information, they can all make the best decisions, the sellers in competing with one another, and the buyers in selecting the best offers, so that everybody is better off as a result. Instead, what happens, the more the food sector profits, the sicker we all get, the more denuded the planet gets. So clearly that's not a market result. Either the market theory doesn't work, or else they're distorting the system. And there's a little bit of both, but if you can point me a place in the agricultural and food system where the free market is operating, I want to see it, really I want to see it. I don't know of a single example where that's the case. That plutocracy is working very effectively to rig the rules in their benefit. So you need to expose that and make it so it's not politically feasible for that to occur. But if they're in control of government, how are you going to do that? That's why we need the Political Leadership Institute. So all of these different pieces for us work together in that particular way. So then, political feasibility, just to run through this very quickly, you have to expose the false solutions. You have to, first of all, identify what they are. You have to have an alternative ready to place. You can't just be waving your hands. Then you have to expose and ridicule that false solution so that it is not politically feasible. And that center square is what we want to target as political feasibility. The masses of people are symbolic of what the majority of the population actually wants. And then you work to create those alternatives and bring them into political feasibility by, first of all, making them work, and then actually making sure that the population at large is aware of them. So that's the theory of change, and then the idea is to implement that and institute it through governance. So movement generation has developed that, we've adopted that, and here I teased you before that I talked to you about this woman, Daniela Meadows. So unfortunately, she left us very early due to cancer. She was an expert systems analyst, and here's the piece of wisdom that I teased to you. She said, you don't shift the system by cleverly finding the leverage point. And the reason why she could make a statement like that is that she wasn't referring to hard systems. Hard systems are like your watch. If it breaks down, you can bring in your watch to 10 different clock repair people. And because that system is hard, meaning predictable, competent clock repair people will all agree on what's wrong and what needs to be done to fix it. When you introduce humans into it, you get soft systems. We can all look at the same set of data and we can conclude completely different things. They're unpredictable by nature. So what she was saying about a soft system was this. Don't try to tweak leverage points. You change a system as long as people are free and have information and they can make their own choices by changing the purpose of the system. So we have to get away from an understanding of a food system whose objective is to produce as much profit as possible for stockholders, to be as productive and efficient as possible in terms of bushels per yield and not in terms of people fed per acre. All of that needs to be atomized. We need to replace that with a vision of a system that actually nourishes people, regenerates the land, and provides livelihood for everybody involved in the system. If you change the purpose of the system, then people are ingenious, entrepreneurial, and they'll reconfigure the whole system. You don't have to worry about the details. So that's the vision that we have, and this is what we're working for, and I hope all of you are working for, and I'm thrilled to be here and support everything that you folks are doing. And Leah will bring us home.